This video will cover moderate part 1 questions regarding the topic of derivatives trigonometric functions. From now, derivatives of trigonometric functions will be getting difficult. If you find it hard, please review chain rule first. Here are the basic differentiation formulas for 6 trigonometric functions. Please remember that only functions starting with a c have a negative sign. Number 1. Y equals cosine x times the square root of tangent x. We can rewrite as y equals cosine x times tangent x to the power of 1 over 2. Use the product rule. Fg prime equals f prime g plus fg prime. So y prime equals cosine x prime times tangent x to the power of 1 over 2 plus cosine x times tangent x to the power of 1 over 2 prime. Then cosine x prime equals minus sine x times tangent x to the power of 1 over 2 is the square root of tangent x plus cosine x times, think of it as u equals tangent x, so d dx u to the power of 1 over 2 equals 1 over 2 u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. So 1 over 2 times u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. Then u is tangent x. Keep the inner function. Then minus sine x square root of tangent x plus cosine x times 1 over 2. Back to the radical form, 1 over square root of tangent x times tangent x prime equals secant squared x. The final answer is minus sine x square root of tangent x plus cancel the cosine x and 1 secant x. So secant x over 2 square root of tangent x. Number 2, we can rewrite as y equals sine x plus the square root of sine x to the power of 1 over 2. Then y prime equals, think of it as u equals inner function. So 1 over 2 u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. Keep the inner function. Sine x plus the square root of sine x. Sine x plus square root of sine x equals 1 over 2 times sine x plus the square root of sine x to the power of minus 1 over 2. And we can rewrite as sine x plus sine x to the power of 1 over 2 prime equals 1 over 2 sine x plus the square root of sine x to the power of minus 1 over 2. Then sine x prime equals cosine x plus sine x to the power of 1 over 2 prime. Now another chain rule is here. Think of it as u equals sine x. Then u to the power of 1 over 2 prime equals 1 over 2 times u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. The inner function is sine x equals 1 over 2 times sine x plus the square root of sine x to the power of minus 1 over 2 times cosine x plus 1 over 2 times 1 over square root of sine x. times sine x prime equals cosine x. Then 1 over 2, back to the radical form, square root of sine x plus the square root of sine x times cosine x plus cosine x over 2 square root of sine x. If we want to factor more, take out the common factor cosine x, then cosine x over 2 square root of sine x plus square root of sine x times 1 plus 1 over 2 square root of sine x. Number 3, use the quotient rule. U over v prime equals u prime v minus u v prime over v squared. Then y prime equals sine squared x prime times cosine cubed x minus sine squared x times cosine cubed x prime over cosine cubed x squared. Sine squared x prime equals, I can solve here, sine x squared prime equals, think about it, sine x equals u, then u squared prime equals 2u, then u prime, the inner function is sine x, so 2 sine x times sine x prime equals cosine x. Cosine cubed x prime equals, we can rewrite as cosine x cubed prime equals, think of it, u equals cosine x, so u cubed prime equals 3 u squared times u prime, the inner function is cosine x, then 3 times cosine squared x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x. So minus 3 cosine squared x times sine x. Back to the original. 2 sine x cosine x times cosine cubed x minus sine squared x times minus 3 cosine squared x sine x over cosine to the power of 6x and cancel the cosine squared x. This is only 1 left, this is 4 left. So we can rewrite as 2 sine x cosine x times cosine x is cosine squared x, make positive 3 sine squared x times sine x is sine cubed x over cosine to the power of 4x equals, we can factor, take out sine x, then 2 cosine squared x plus 3 sine squared x over cosine to the power of 4x. Number 4, we can rewrite as y equals x cubed plus sine x squared to the power of 5. Use the general power rule. Think of it as u equals the inner function. So y equals u to the power of 5. Then dy dx equals 5 u to the power of 4 times u prime. Then y prime equals 5 u to the power of 4 times u prime. The inner function is x cubed plus sine squared x, x cubed plus sine x squared. So 5 times x cubed plus sine squared x to the power of 4 times x cubed prime is 3x squared plus, now u is sine x, just think of it as u squared. So u squared prime equals 2u times u prime. Keep the inner function is sine x equals 5 times x cubed plus sine squared x to the power of 4 times 3x squared plus 2 sine x times sine x prime is cosine x. This is the final answer, or we can rewrite as 5 times x cubed plus sine squared x to the power of 4 times 3x squared plus 2 sine x cosine x is sine 2x. Number 5, we can rewrite as y equals tangent cosine x to the power of 3. Use the general power rule. Think of it as y equals u to the power of 3. If y equals u to the power of 3, then dy dx equals 3u squared times u prime. Then y prime equals 3u to the power of 2 times u prime. Keep the inner function tangent cosine x tangent cosine x equals 3 times tangent squared cosine x times, now think of it as u equals cosine x, so d dx tangent u equals secant square u times u prime. So tangent u prime equals secant square u times u prime. Keep the inner function cosine x. So 3 times tangent squared cosine x times secant squared cosine x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x. The final answer is minus 3 tangent squared cosine x secant squared cosine x times sine x. Number 6, we can rewrite as y equals cosine square root of cosine x to the power of 1 over 2. Think of it as u equals cosine square root of cosine x, then y equals u to the power of 1 over 2, then dy dx equals 1 over 2 u to the power of 1 over 2 minus 1 times u prime. Then y prime equals 1 over 2 u to the power of 1 over 2 minus 1 is minus 1 over 2 times u prime. Keep the inner function cosine square root of cosine x cosine square root of cosine x equals 1 over 2 cosine square root of cosine x to the power of minus 1 over 2 times. Now u equals square root of cosine x, so d dx cosine u equals minus sine u times u prime. So minus sine u times u prime equals 1 over 2 times back to the radical form, 1 over square root of cosine square root of cosine x times minus here, then sine square root of cosine x times square root of cosine x prime equals, we can rewrite as cosine x to the power of 1 over 2 prime. Just think of it. This is u to the power of 1 over 2. So 1 over 2 u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. The u is cosine x equals 1 over 2 times, back to the radical form, 1 over square root of cosine x times cosine x prime equals minus sine x over 2 square root of cosine x. Then back to the original, minus sine x over 2 square root of cosine x. The final answer is make positive sine x times sine square root of cosine x over 4 square root of cosine x times square root of cosine x. Number 7, we can rewrite as y equals sine squared x minus 3 over sine squared x plus 3 to the power of 1 over 2. Just think of it. U equals the inner function. Y prime equals 1 over 2 times u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. Then keep the inner function. Sine squared x minus 3 over sine squared x plus 3 sine squared x minus 3 over sine squared x plus 3 equals 1 over 2 times, we can rewrite as sine squared x minus 3 to the power of minus 1 over 2 over sine squared x plus 3 to the power of minus 1 over 2 times sine squared x minus 3 over sine squared x plus 3 prime equals, use the quotient rule, u over v prime equals u prime v minus ub prime over v squared. So sine squared x minus 3 prime times sine squared x plus 3 minus sine squared x minus 3 times sine squared x plus 3 over sine squared x plus 3 squared. And sine squared x prime equals sine x squared prime, then u squared prime equal 2u times u prime. The inner function is sine x, so 2 sine x times sine x prime equals cosine x. Then back to here, sine squared x minus 3 prime equals 2 sine x cosine x times sine squared x plus 3 minus sine squared x minus 3 times sine squared x plus 3 prime equals 2 sine x cosine x over sine squared x plus 3 squared equals expand 2 sine cubed cosine plus 6 sine cosine minus the first one 2 sine cubed cosine then plus 6 sine cosine over sine squared x plus 3 squared, then cancelled. This one is 12 sine x cosine x over sine squared x plus 3 squared. Then back to the original. 12 sine x cosine x over sine squared x plus 3 squared. The final answer is 6. Then 6 sine x cosine x over sine squared x minus 3 to the power of 1 over 2. Then this one and this one is like term. Sine squared x plus 3 to the power of 3 over 2. Or we can rewrite as 3 sine 2x over sine squared x minus 3 to the power of 1 over 2 sine squared x plus 3 to the power of 3 over 2, because 2 sine x times cosine x equals sine 2x. Number 8, we can rewrite as tangent x to the power of 3 times secant x to the power of 4. Then use the product rule. Fg prime equals f prime g plus f g prime. Then y prime equals tangent x to the power of 3 prime times secant x to the power of 4 plus tangent x to the power of 3 times secant x to the power of 4 prime equals, think of it as u cubed prime, so 3u squared times u prime. The inner function is tangent x times secant x to the power of 4 plus tangent x to the power of 3 times, think of it as u to the power of 4 prime, 4u cubed times u prime. The inner function is secant x equals 3 tangent squared x times tangent x prime equals secant squared x times secant to the power of 4x plus tangent cubed x times 4 secant cubed x times secant x prime equals secant x tangent x. The final answer is 3 times tangent squared x times, make together, secant to the power of 6x plus 4 tangent cubed x and tangent x. Tangent to the power of 4x times secant cubed x and secant x. Secant to the power of 4x. Or you can factor, take out the common factor, tangent squared x and secant to the power of 4x times 3 secant squared x plus 4 tangent squared x. Number 9. Use the general power rule. Think of it as y equals tangent u, then dy dx equals secant squared u times u prime. Then y prime equals secant squared u part square root of x cubed plus 4x times square root of x cubed plus 4x prime. Then we can rewrite as secant squared square root of x cubed plus 4x times x cubed plus 4x to the power of 1 over 2 prime equals secant squared square root of x cubed plus 4x times. Now think of it as u to the power of 1 over 2. So d dx u to the power of 1 over 2 equals 1 over 2u to the power of 1 over 2 minus 1 times u prime. So u to the power of 1 over 2 prime equals 1 over 2 u to the power of minus 1 over 2 times u prime. The inner function is x cubed plus 4x. X cubed plus 4x equals secant squared square root of x cubed plus 4x times 1 over 2 times, back to the radical form, 1 over square root of x cubed plus 4x times x cubed plus 4x prime equals 3x squared plus 4. The final answer is 3x squared plus 4 secant squared square root of x cubed plus 4x over 2 square root of x cubed plus 4x. Number 10, we can rewrite as y equals 1 over cosine x minus sine x over cosine x over 1 over cosine x plus sine x over cosine x. Then times cosine x over cosine x. Then expand the first one. 1 minus sine x over 1 plus sine x. Use the quotient rule. U over v prime equals u prime b minus u b prime over v squared. Then y prime equals 1 minus sine x prime times 1 plus sine x minus 1 minus sine x times 1 plus sine x prime over 1 plus sine x squared equals 1 prime is 0, then minus sine x prime equals cosine x. Then keep the second one. Minus 1 minus sine x times 1 prime equals 0, then sine prime equals cosine x over 1 plus sine x squared equals minus cosine x minus sine x cosine x. This one minus cosine x. This one plus sine x cosine x over 1 plus sine x squared. Then cancelled. The final answer is minus 2 cosine x over 1 plus sine x squared. This is the last one. Just think of it as y equals u cubed. Then y prime equals 3u squared times u prime. Keep the inner function. Sin x plus cosine x over sin x minus cosine x. Sin x plus cosine x over sin x minus cosine x equals 3 times sin x plus cosine x over sin x minus cosine x squared times, use the quotient rule, u over v prime equals u prime v minus ub prime over v squared sin x plus cosine x prime times sin x minus cosine x minus sin x plus cosine x times sin x minus cosine x prime over sin x minus cosine x squared equals 3 times sin x plus cosine x over sin x minus cosine x squared times sin x prime equals cosine x plus cosine x prime equals minus sin x times, keep the second one, sin x minus cosine x minus sin x plus cosine x times sin x prime equals cosine x minus cosine x plus equals minus sin x. Make the positive and over sin x minus cosine x squared equals 3 times sin x plus cosine x over sin x minus cosine x squared times, expand cosine sine minus cosine squared minus sine squared plus sine cosine minus sine cosine plus sine squared plus cosine squared plus sine cosine over sin x minus cosine x squared. We can rewrite as 3 times sin x plus cosine x squared over sin x minus cosine x squared times cosine sine minus sine cosine, sine cosine minus sine cosine. Then these two make minus cosine square plus sine square, which is minus 1. And this one is another minus 1. So minus 2 over sin x minus cosine x squared. Then the final answer is minus 6 sin x plus cosine x squared over sin x minus cosine x to the power of 4. I hope this video has been helpful. The previous lesson is linked in the description bar below. If you have any questions, leave them in a comment. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe for more.